Hello and good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the Microsoft Tech Talk on 4 ways to get the most out of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. I'd just like to introduce Matt Smith. Matt Smith has a wealth of experience in the managed services provision in Microsoft particularly. He's currently Microsoft Solutions Architect at Softworks, and he works with a number of clients in terms of architecture and the design of our managed services and solutions. And today he's really going to be looking more in depth at Defender for Endpoint, and we're going to be looking at iOS and Android automated investigation, attack surface reduction, as well as threat vulnerability and management. And so at this point, I'll just hand over to you, Matt, and you can take it over from here. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Patrick. So as Patrick said, we're going to have a little look here today into what Defender for Endpoint actually does for us. And what I want to try and do is give you a bit more of an understanding how it's so much more than just an antivirus product, and give you an idea of how you might use it or how you might gain some benefits from it for your organization. So we're going to dive kind of straight in, do this live on the various management consoles. Just to make you all aware, today there is a service mitigation in progress at the moment on part of the Microsoft Azure platform. So some of these dashboards may not refresh very quickly, but we love to try and do this live. So let's see where it takes us to. So to get us started, let's jump in to begin with around the Intune service. Now, the reason I want to start on the Microsoft Intune portal, there we go, is really the simplest way to actually get the deployment out onto your devices is to do it through the Microsoft Intune console. Now, when we need to deploy this out, there's actually a kind of pre-built package for us to use that we can pick out from the Defender for Endpoint portal. I'll show you where part of that is shortly. But getting it out onto the PCs couldn't be kind of more straightforward. We have a predefined configuration profile option from Microsoft. So we've got one here that we've called Onboarding for Defender. And in this here, we just simply tell it that the function that we want to do is to onboard the devices, the Windows devices, into the Defender service, and then it requires us to upload our package file. Now that's what we get from the Defender for Endpoint portal. And then we have a couple of controls just around how we want things to be reported back to the Defender service. Now, Defender's not only a Microsoft Windows feature or function, it will also deploy out onto the macOS devices. There's very few configuration options that we need to put onto macOS, so we simply have a built-in package here that we can deploy from Intune for all our managed macOS devices. So it's simply a case of selecting the package that we're going to put out onto the machines. That's all pre-configured for us, and we just select the devices or the users that we're going to assign that package out to. So let's say we're going to capture all machines, hit create, and then all the macOS devices on their next check-in cycle will download the Defender for Endpoint service and check in against our tenant, because it's done based on the user that's logged in. So deployment for the Defender for Endpoint service, nice and simple from a Windows or a Mac OS point of view. Now we'll cover a bit more of this towards the end of this talk, but just to cover how we get the Defender service connected to iOS and Android devices, much the same as the Mac OS service. From our app deployment from the stores, we have available to us the Defender for Endpoint app for both Google Android and for iOS. Now, how you've chosen to integrate with iOS may be that you're asking the users to do the download, so it's just a direct from the store, or hopefully you've gone through the process to join Apple Business Manager, so you can issue it through the volume purchase program. Then there's no prompt, no requirement for anybody to authenticate to the Apple Store in order to get the app installed on the device. So you can force it out onto the managed machines. Google Play Store, much the same. You can force that out as long as they're enrolled for either enterprise full device enrollment or the work profile that you get through Intune. So that's getting the service out onto the devices. Now, the whole point of this talk really is to look at what do we use it for and how does it work. So I'm going to switch into the Defender Security Center portal. Now, those of you that keep up to tabs with Microsoft and kind of current developments will know that a large chunk of this is all moving over into the new Security Center. So that's security.microsoft.com. Some of that is still in preview, some of it's work in progress. So for today, I'm going to stick to this Security Center portal, but in the next couple of months or so, everything will move over into the Microsoft Security Center. So familiarize yourselves with that new user interface. All of these screens I'm going to show you are just being lifted and ported straight over to that environment. So to start off with, let's dive into the threat management piece from Defender Security Center, because that's really the kind of key to getting the most out of Defender for Endpoint, is to use it to kind of mitigate threats and vulnerabilities that your machines have, because kind of antivirus is quite an old school approach to just sort of mopping up as we go along. Really what we want to do is build ourselves a secure environment that's not susceptible to the problems, right from the outset. So we'll start in the threat vulnerability management area of the service and drop into the dashboard. This is going to give us a quick overview of how, as a business, all our devices look in terms of what they're exposed for. So in here, we've got an overall exposure score of 49 out of 100. So obviously 0 means there is nothing exposed, and that's kind of quite rare because, as we all know, new vulnerabilities come out every day, every week, and getting all those systems patched and the settings changed and things does take time. So this is going to be a constantly fluctuating number. We get a little breakdown for how the different areas that we're monitoring within the devices score. So how does the operating system score overall, or things like the security controls, and a kind of quick chart there on high, medium and low distribution for it. Key piece to look at here is that there's a set of top recommendations always shown on the right hand side of the screen. So these are the things that you can do across your business that will have the highest impact in terms of reducing exposure with one particular action. And I'll show you how we see all the recommendations in just a moment. Now, if I scroll down here a little, you'll see we've also got on this dashboard the top events of things that are occurring. So where we're seeing new vulnerabilities or assessing kind of new things going on the machines, they'll show up there as a quick view. Which pieces of software and which devices present the highest risk to us as an organization. And all these charts and tables on the dashboard here are all clickable. For example, if I go into the security controls score here, it's going to drop into the security recommendations area of the service and show me all of those that are pertinent to a security control change that could be made to improve our device or our posture from as a business as a whole. Now, if I look into here and just start to drill down through how this area of the service works, where we've got a recommendation, the system will tell us that if there are any kind of known threats, and this is where we tie into Threat Insights, which is a service that's part of your subscription from Microsoft. So we can assess for ourselves what the impact would be of applying some of these changes. So if we look here, there's a recommendation. 33 of our 33 devices in this organization have checked in and advised that they don't have a control in place to block untrusted and unsigned processes from a USB device. If I click on that, I get a view here of what the kind of description is, what we can do about it, and I can scroll down through this list here, and I can actually get an export into an Excel or CSV file of all the devices that do have this potential threat exposed. Now, as you can see, there's quite a big list of things here, so we need some sort of process to work out, well, A, are we going to apply all of these? Are they relevant to us? And B, if we are, how are we going to keep track of them actually getting completed? So against each of these recommendations, we've got some controls that we can use. So for things that aren't relevant to us, or we have a reason for why we're not going to do it, so if we're not going to block things from running from a USB, we might come into this exception piece here, decide whether it's for everybody or it might be a specific set of devices. So maybe we do allow, in this case, the service team to run anything from USB. We give a reason why we're doing it, so we set it as an accepted risk. But if we look at kind of how things like our cybersecurity guidelines or our ISO guidelines advise us, we should always continuously review these things. So while we're setting an expectation, we always set a review time or a period at which that exception expires. And that's a maximum of 1 year, because you'll find that that falls in line with a lot of those kind of guidance and recommendations that we see. So we'd set that on there and say, right, I'm going to come back and check this again in 90 days to see if we should still be blocking USB. And then that would stop that notification or that recommendation appearing against all the devices that belong to that particular group. So a nice simple way to deal with exceptions to the rule. Where we do want to deal with it and address that, we can create a remediation action for it. We can decide again which devices we're going to create those against. What's our priority for applying this? So let's say this is a fairly low piece, and when do we want that done by? We'll say the end of the month. We can put some comments in here if we want to for the people that are going to actually implement this, so other members of the team, or if it's a very small team, it might still be the same person, but it's a way for keeping track that you're actually applying these controls and getting them done. So when we submit that remediation on there, what the service is doing is using this remediation section here under threat and vulnerability management to keep track of all those actions that need to be completed. And when we go back into it here, it gives us a little progress status. There's only really a kind of have done it or haven't done it in this particular instance. So we can mark that off as completed when we've applied the control and it's been dealt with. The related recommendation items here take us back into why we should do it, and it's another way for the person who's dealing with remediating those problems to address those. So it gives you a tiny little insight into the kind of security recommendations piece. If I go into the security recommendations menu, rather than it be filtered by, as we did there, the security settings, or it might have been operating system or application ones, this gives me a complete breakdown of all the recommendations across the organization for all the device types that have checked in. So a good example of that exception piece there might be something around JRE or the whole Java environment. As I'm sure most of us have come across from time to time, there are applications that require a fixed version of Oracle, so we might have certain devices where we use that exception piece there to say, no, these devices are going to be on an older version, and we'll keep reviewing it over a certain time period. Now, looking at this list, you can see on here that there's a large number of recommendations to do, and not all of them fall into that category of just update or apply the required patch to the service. Little tip that I want to give here is if you go back and look at the endpoint tech talk that we did, we looked there at the baselines, the Windows security baselines. You'll find through Endpoint Manager in here and Endpoint Security, using these security baselines, getting them tested, getting them out there and applying them, they are defined, or they have in them the vast majority of all these settings that will come up as potential vulnerabilities and items that you may want to remediate when you're using the Defender for Endpoint service. So these things to go in and change and the recommendations to do can largely be covered around Windows anyway, through those Microsoft recommended baselines. So they're definitely worth having a look at, and that's where Intune or Endpoint Manager and Defender for Endpoint really kind of cross over and start to kind of help each other. So when I'm looking at these security recommendations that come up, I've got from the recommendation itself an ability to drop in and get some more detail about what's going on across my business from that piece of software or whatever it is that needs to be remediated. So if I look at from a point of view of Windows 10 across the organization, I can see from here how many security recommendations I've got that relate to Windows 10 or controls and things that I should implement or updates that I should get applied. I can see what the vulnerabilities are that have created those recommendations. So you can see here we're referencing the sort of industry standards, CVSS scores, to decide the priority against them. And again, as always in Endpoint, Defender for Endpoint, we've got the ability to drop in and see directly exactly which machines each of these vulnerabilities or recommendations applies to. We can also see for certain software versions or certain software titles what versions are out there across the devices, and again these can all be clicked through, so I can see which of the versions, which machines are reporting back in that they've got the latest versions of Windows 10 on them, and you'll get the same thing from Adobe and various other vendors' products as well. Specifically, when we come to Microsoft products, we can look at the missing knowledge-based articles. Some other vendors are starting to come into there as well, so worth going in to have a look. But it will tell you exactly which patches, what the knowledge article is that's missing, and in most cases, it will give you a link back to be able to actually go and look up from the update service catalog from that vendor what the patch is and get some more detail directly from the patch. So it's all about understanding the posture of the organization, what recommended security fixes and controls can we put in place to mitigate potential threats coming into the organization through our devices, what vulnerabilities have we discovered so that we can understand why they're there, which devices they apply to, and then by giving us that ability to flag a remediation action against it, we've got a controlled way to go through and assign out or make sure that we are keeping up to date and keeping on top of what's going on across the business and getting these controls in place, making sure they're actually actioned and completed. So what you can imagine from here is we're also building a picture of what's out there across the organization. So we can look at this from a point of view of the software itself. So we had a little look there at Windows 10, but we've also got a whole wealth of other vendors' products out there across the organization. So in here, we've still got some machines running Shockwave or the Flash players from Adobe. They've all reached end of life, so we've got a quick way to see from here where that's installed, and then if we've got it delivered through our MDM or our configuration manager or some sort of device and software management service, and we can use that to pull that from the device and uninstall it, or we might need to create remediation actions against the devices and the software in order to go out there and manually address that. all of this discovered vulnerability piece around this is all coming from that threat insight service that you get as part of the Defender for Endpoint system. Now, returning back to the dashboard briefly, I mentioned quickly that we've got this ability to look on here for our kind of top sort of exposed devices. So up to now, we've been looking at broad views of threats across the organization and threats within a particular software product. On here, we can go in and see that same sort of scenario, but from a device point of view. So we can see from the device what we kind of gauge its exposure level to be. So that can help us decide how much priority we want to give to it. And we can see who the kind of logged on user is against it. But more importantly, we can see the specific security recommendations that apply to that particular device, so things that need to be actioned and done. And just as we did before, we can come into here and we can open the recommendation, open the software page, and then create a remediation action against it so that we cover it. We can see all those vulnerabilities from the threat insight service as well, so we can get an understanding as to why those pieces are there, and we get a view per device of the missing patches that need to go onto that system. So some of these patches will fall in line with your patching schedule. So if you've got update rings in place, then obviously you need to take that into account as you're looking through it. Now, gonna from here just switch slightly into how we can use the Defender for Endpoint service to see and understand when we've found a problem, what might have caused it or where it might have come from. So against every device, if we've triggered an alert for an incident or an action or an activity that's occurred on the machine, then we've got the ability to come into the timeline for the device. Now, the timeline is a feed of all the security events from the system, and this looks like it's where the Azure service is going to cause me a problem, so just bear with me and I'll just reload the page. Let's see if we can get a device open so I can show you this. So from the timeline, okay, so from the timeline, we'd be able to see all the security events that have occurred on that particular device, but we can then use that to drill down and see all the actions or activities that occurred around that particular security event. We'll give it one more refresh to see if we can actually load this morning, because it's very useful to be able to show you if I can. There we go. So on here, we've got a timeline of all the events that have occurred on this particular system. So I can see on here, it's flagged a log for an anomalous memory allocation in Word. Now, depending on what our rules are, that may have notified our service team with an email or a flow, but they'll come back into this portal here. They can see quickly kind of what the processes were that were involved and what ran, but they can also drill down in here to look for related events that occurred alongside that action. So we're not just talking about the security event, because often there are things that build up to that security event that we want to understand what happened, so we can then drill down and find out exactly what occurred and kind of figure out what led up to it, what happened after it, has anything else occurred around that. So as part of our kind of discovery process that our support team would do, they can use this from here to actually review almost to a certain extent the event logs of those particular devices, and this is all being reported in by the Defender for Endpoint service, and they can adjust these queries to see what happened. If they just want 1 minute either side of the event, then they can apply that and just see that kind of much smaller window of time. So it's often very helpful when you're trying to establish why was something blocked, what actually happened around the time that was blocked, And as we select each one of these, it gives us that same nice kind of familiar breakdown, which processes were incurred and which, in this case, which IP addresses were contacted, because that was noted from the network connection. So we get a nice kind of detailed view of what was going on around that particular action, and we can read through each of these events to establish what's been going on. Now, to start to kind of finish up around the threat hunting piece, we've got a database in here that comes from that threat insight service. So in this weaknesses area of the service, this is a complete breakdown or a complete list of all the kind of known vulnerabilities across the board from the Microsoft Threat Insight service. So if you've heard of something that might be kind of out there and you want to know, does it affect your particular organization? If you know the CVE entry, or you just know the product that's affected, you can come into here and search this vulnerability weaknesses database, and it will tell you, because it will sort them by the ones that apply to your organization, it will tell you how many devices have that particular vulnerability against them for your organization. And again, you can drill down into here and you can look at which security recommendations have I got that relate to that particular vulnerability or weakness that's been discovered. So I can come back into here, see all the recommendations that I should be applying to my environment, and there's that kind of reference back again to the Threat Insight service, what exactly is this particular recommendation related to. So that's a very, very quick view of what you can do with the threat and vulnerability management piece of Defender for Endpoint. What I'm going to do now is just kind of shift focus very slightly and just look at what we can do around attack surface reduction, and then where we go with the kind of web controls. So all of the implementation for attack surface reduction controls comes through our device management service. So I'm going to show this or explain this through the Endpoint Manager capabilities. But you can also do a lot of these controls through group policy or through configuration manager if that's your choice. There's multiple ways to go about this, but these are settings that you can invoke and leverage by having the Defender for Endpoint service or subscription on your plan, and by sending instruction to it through either your MDM or your group policy controls. So for Endpoint Manager or for Intune, we come into Endpoint Security, and when we're talking particularly around attack surface reduction, we're looking at a set of rules that we can build through this menu option in here. So there's a couple of ones that I just want to sort of highlight so I can help kind of understand what's possible here. So if I'm creating a policy in here and I'm looking at app and browser isolation, when I create this profile, what I'm doing is I'm enabling the system to work with all the apps that are installed, or with Microsoft Edge, or both, and I'm enabling it to effectively containerize each application in its own kind of bubble using Hyper-V on the device. And then these controls allow me to put some blocks and some kind of guards in between those applications and all the other applications on the device, or the rest of the operating system and the internet and anything else that that PC is doing. So it's using the Defender for Endpoint service to interact with Hyper-V, part of Windows 10, and to take those applications and kind of place them in a small bubble so that we can kind of protect what they have access to and manage what they can connect to. When we're talking about the Edge browser, we're talking about creating that same sort of Hyper-V style container around each tab. So it's all about minimizing the risk of kind of cross-application transfer of data, or threats or problems that might occur through that kind of process. So that's what we mean when we talk about isolation, and that kind of hardware isolation is what it tends to be referred to. It's about using a virtualization technology and the endpoint, Defender for Endpoint service to place those apps under that level of control. The next area that I just want to show you about is using the application attack surface reduction, controls for folder level management. So a typical kind of scenario that you see a lot is that kind of crypto process where, you know, somebody's clicked to download something and an executable's got onto their machine, and that's then started to chew through folders and files and apply encryption to it. What we can do using these ASR rules in here is we can place protection around specific folders. Now, all this takes a relative amount of testing and things to ensure that you're placing the right controls on and the right executables can get to them. But for example, if you're talking about where the finance package lives and you know the executables that go to that, and you know the folder paths where the data for the finance service would sit, you can come into here, place the paths to the folders, UNC paths or the local disk folders into there, and then place alongside it a list of executables, including their path where the executable runs from, and that will then ensure that only these executables have access to these protected folder areas. And you can build as many of these policies as you want to kind of group those things together. So that's another really good way that you can go to protect the systems, as well as all the built-in kind of functions around Office and Acrobat and the usual kind of suspects, the blocking kind of unknown or things that don't pass the smart screen filters that have been brought in on a USB stick. They're all available in here under these ASR detection rules from Endpoint Security. Now, you can achieve a whole lot more with attack surface reduction on here. There are a host of kind of device control features that you can bring in, and you can also, through the configuration of just the built-in Defender for Endpoint services on Windows, you can place in here the same sort of controls over your network connections. So if I go into here and look at the exploit guard properties of Defender, in here I can place on here my kind of network filtering that will leverage the threat insights service for kind of reputation based domains, and then you can audit or block access to anything that will be on that kind of threat database list. So different ways you can come about it, but the goal there is to reduce the risk profile by placing these ASR protection rules in, and your quickest way to do that is to come into Endpoint Security, look at the attack surface reduction rules, and then put in place the rules and the application controls in here. These are also included, or a lot of these are also included in the security baselines. So again, if you don't have a defined set of rules around all the other controls that Windows should have in place, and you're just looking at this from an attack surface reduction, you might want to go back and review the security baseline, put that in place and test that, because again, you can cross off a whole range of potential threats and problems in one hit. Now, at the beginning, I said deploying it, you just get your Defender for Endpoint package. There's a handy link that's been placed here into the Endpoint Security piece of Endpoint Manager. So if you're going to use Endpoint Manager to do that deployment, when you come to create your configuration profile to pass that out, from here, the Defender for Endpoint package can be acquired through the links here, and that will take you straight to it from the admin consoles. Okay, last piece, and then we'll start to look at some of the Q&A and see what we've got in there, is when we come to talk about kind of identifying risks and incidents through the Defender for Endpoint service. What we're talking about is how far do we want to go with automatically remediating, triggering an incident, and then the system providing that to us for review. Now, setting that up is remarkably straightforward. It's simply a case of coming into the Defender for Endpoint settings and creating some device groups. So for these particular people or these particular machines, we want to apply a certain level of automated response. So fully deal with and remediate everything, or do I want to be notified to then go in and make a decision and things get put into quarantine before anything's actually applied to the device. And it starts with kind of actually get IT to address every potential threat and quarantine it, or everything that falls outside of the kind of temporary folders that Windows would normally have in place. Or you can do it, which is, I think, is probably one that I see quite a lot, for just the core folders, so the Windows folder and the program files folders, where those things need approval, but everything else just gets automatically remediated, or the full remediation piece. And then you just filter by tags or the operating system type that you're using there to pull that list of devices together. So having that in place means that the system will then generate alerts and incidents against the particular machine. So the alerts is just where it's discovered something that's going on the system. That would generally be set up to send a notification to your service desk, so that you can come into here and then again have a look, see what occurred, which machine was it against, what processes were used, and then as a set of steps that you go through as part of the service team, you'd flag that as having been resolved or dealt with. Was it an actual alert or is it a false positive? And you might link that to specific incidents. When we're talking about alerts that need to be actioned, if you've got a larger team of engineers working on it, then you can assign that to the person who's actioning that event. So there's a way to filter from this alerts list to see only the items that are assigned to that particular engineer. So you can filter those out. Again, that would depend largely on how big the environment is. For the automated investigations, they come through this automated investigations menu on here. So where something has been discovered going on one of the systems, it will generate a notification in here. Again, typically creates a service desk ticket either through an email process, creates this log of event, and then breaks down what occurred, when it occurred, who the user was that was on the system at the time, which system was it, what are the software versions it's running, and then it allows you to drop through into the investigation piece here. And then this is where we start to leverage the graph functions from behind the Azure platform. So we can see on here when it occurred and all the related pieces around it. So we can see the files that were analyzed as part of it, where we found those suspicious processes, what were those particular processes on the machine, and we start to make decisions about whether or not they then need to be investigated further. Are we seeing them elsewhere across the organization, or do we need to create exceptions for those because there are, for whatever reason, they triggered the alert? Then we could look at the analytics there to find that out. They may just need to be whitelisted specifically for your organization. So that's how we use the investigation process to pull all of this information together using that automatic remediation capability. So it's about getting all the information in front of your team as easily as possible so they can identify what happened and make informed decisions around it as to whether things need to be whitelisted, or we need to pull some software from the organization, or there might just be a version of software out there that needs to be managed and dealt with. So that in a nutshell is kind of the core pieces to bits that you'll work with in Defender for Endpoint and how you implement them using the Endpoint Management Service. One final piece that we haven't touched on a lot here is around web content filtering. So the premise of web content filtering here, and this is really where the mobile devices come in, is the agents on the machines can apply these web content filtering rules. Because they're applied by the agents on the machines, the service will perform these kind of checks and controls, which I'll take you through, wherever the device is, because it's being applied by the device. This is really the first step of how we're integrating the mobile platforms, so Android and iOS. When they install the app on the devices essentially create a VPN to themselves to capture all the outbound traffic that's going to the mobile provider or the Wi-Fi network that the device is attached to, rather than have to manage and maintain VPNs back to the office or to Azure or somewhere else, which would be costly and creates quite an overhead on the device. It's doing it locally within the iOS or the Android device and basically taking the outbound network connection of the device, pointing it back at the Defender Security Center agent that's on the device, and then the agent is using its rules set that it's getting from this web content filter control to apply some inspection to what's going on and then decide to allow or drop traffic. At the same time, it's also reporting all of that back, so you'll see those iOS and Android devices in the devices part of the Defender Security Center. When we add one of these policies on, it's relatively basic in what it can do at this stage. It's about blocking category-based services. So I'm not going to suggest at this stage that this is by any means a replacement to the likes of your Zscaler service or any of those capabilities. But if you don't have anything else in place, it's a very simple way to come through here and block kind of potentially offensive or kind of productivity loss type services. But it's fairly simplistic in its approach. It's an on or off against the categories and then set against certain devices. So this isn't user-based either, it's device-based. So by saying these devices have this web filtering policy control in place, but it can be consistent across Windows and Mac and iOS and Android because it's being delivered by the agent on the device. Okay, so I hope that does give you some kind of indication as to what's possible with the Defender for Endpoint service and some ideas about how you might deploy that to the organization. I think what we'll do now is just have a look through and see what we've got in the Q&A section. Feel free to post any extra questions that you've got and I'll do my best to try and answer them. Okay, so Jeremy, does this system require the installation of an agent on each endpoint being monitored? Short answer, yes. It's an agent-based service that sits on all the devices. And like I said, we've got agents for Mac, Windows, iOS, and Android. If you ran a scan, where would it appear? Where would it be? Would it be on the timeline? So the scans that run are issued, or the scans are run on a kind of periodic basis. That's issued to the machine through your endpoint service, like the Microsoft Endpoint Manager, or it might be a group policy that's doing that. So it's run as a periodic scan. They're set generally to always run at least every day. They have a quick scan and a kind of deep scan that you should probably run less frequently for the deep scans. And yes, those report back in. You'll see the scan events against each device on the device events timeline. And the logic is that you only really want to know about when there's a problem or something you need to deal with. So that's where the actions, events, and the automated investigations piece kicks in. And you'll see the things that you need to go and address and deal with from there. Does Defender have to be the primary AV? Short answer is no. So the way Defender for Endpoint is structured is if you want to take advantage of all of these pieces, but don't want it to be your antivirus agent, just install another antivirus product alongside it. By default, Defender will turn off its antivirus engine while another antivirus service exists on the machine. So it's pretty simple to achieve that. There can be some nuances there around Mac OS, so you'd need to test that out depending on what you're trying to do with the various vendors, other antivirus products on Mac OS. How would you implement this in a co-management environment? So in terms of co-management, if we're talking about the config manager or the endpoint manager on-premise servers, they would all be in a hybrid, and the Defender Security Center piece will be configured or used in the same way as we've just kind of shown, but the endpoint manager online function would actually manage the configuration and implement the controls on the PC. All the configuration manager service would really do is get the package onto the device. The device then calls home, and then in that package is the instruction for which tenant for it to associate itself with. What are the prerequisites this can be added to M365 Business? There aren't really any. So for Defender for Endpoint, it's a service you can tag on to anything. So yeah, you can add it to Business Premium. You can pretty much buy it on its own. You obviously need a capability to get the package out onto the devices. So typically it's added on to a bundle that's got the Intune package in it, and you will actually need the Azure AD Premium in order for the devices to register. So there are a couple of little bits there, but essentially if you've got a Business Premium or any of the E plans that include the Intune service, then yeah, you can add that on as a line item. It's obviously included in the full Microsoft 365 E5 package. Can this control the USB ports and block unknown devices from being plugged in? Not specifically. That would be a combination really of using either group policy or endpoint manager to control what's being plugged in. That's really more of a Windows 10 control that's usually combined with a BitLocker control to say these labeled encrypted devices that we've issued to our staff are acceptable for write and everything else is read, or you do something along those lines. What Defender for Endpoint can do is monitor what's on those devices, and it can look at executables and then enforce the smart screen technologies or the blocking of potentially unwanted applications and executable content from being run, and it will obviously monitor that and log it for you and present you with alerts and run the whole automated investigation piece around it. But in terms of specifically blocking named or labeled USB devices, that's a group policy or an endpoint protection, an endpoint manager function. I've got one there, rough cost from Anonymous. I stay away from costs on these particular talks, as some of you have probably heard before. If you want an idea of costs for the service, whether it's part of a bundle or an add-on, contact details are on screen. Just reach out, drop us a line. I'll be able to get one of our account managers just to reply and answer that straight off. You won't need to go through a whole kind of sales exercise with that. They'll just take your details and get you the price straight back. And last one from Richard. No questions from today for once. Good tech talk. Thanks. Yeah, thank you all for joining us. Hopefully you'll be able to join us on our next talk. They're always on the 16th of the month, I believe. Patrick will, and the team will get you some more details sent out if you joined our mailing list. If you haven't, then please visit our website. You'll see the messages on there for when the next talk's coming, and we'll get you some detail around the content for that. There should be a form published into the Q&A for you to answer. This really gives me some feedback. It's like a little mini survey. Also gives you an opportunity to put forward some ideas or anything that you liked about how we did the webinar, and it kind of helps me put together the next one and make sure that it's useful and relevant to you all. Okay, we're a little bit over time, so I'll end there. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you all again next time.